Welcome back to another episode of the Huxley Morton podcast. This week we have a special edition for you where I'm joined by a panel of experts and we're going to be discussing what it takes to change an industry. We've got an incredible lineup for you. I'm joined by Stout, CEO at MedVector and finance expert, should I say, former guest on the Huxley Morton podcast. We've got Ted Barduson, COO at MedVector. Ted is a healthcare and physician practice expert. Then we've got Mr. Craig Lipset, who rarely needs an introduction, but he is the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners and the co-chair of DTRA, an all-round innovation expert. And last but I guess not least, my regular co-host and biometrics expert, Mr. Adam Walker. Guys, welcome to the Huxley Morton podcast.
Good to be back here, James.
Fantastic to have you on. Well, look, guys, as I said a couple of seconds ago, look, we're going to be talking about what it takes to change an industry. So look, I'll throw it out to the floor. Let's get going with this. Who wants to kick us off with what it takes to change an industry?
Okay, I'll jump in.
Take it, Scott.
I'd say that, most industries are similar in that, it requires innovation, sometimes a new type of technology, and a lot of times a catalyst. And kind of what we're seeing in healthcare right now is exactly that. So we've got the new technology that is telemedicine, and then we've got the pandemic, which kind of forced the adoption of telemedicine. And I think it kind of forced everybody to start thinking outside the box.
I'd probably add in there within healthcare, there certainly always seems to have been some type of government impact as well in the process. So just in general, showing my age a little bit, going back to Y2K and the IT engagement there and what happened with that, the requirement for physician practices to have an electronic medical record, forced adoption. Back in 2016, we went from 12,000 codes to 72,000 codes, which impacted the revenue cycle process. And of course, now we have something that certainly isn't government driven, but the pandemic, and that is driving a lot of adoption of telemedicine, as well as in the clinical trial world, obviously an adoption of different processes and a decentralization of what we thought previously we could not do.
Ted, I didn't realize that the adoption for electronic medical records was around Y2K. I never put that together.
There was almost two different instances. There was the Y2K, and then a few years later there was the requirement for an EMR within the physician practices.
Along with funding, right, with the High Tech Act to make that happen. But James, so much of the innovation that we're seeing coming out of the pandemic isn't really a story of new capabilities, as you're hearing from Ted and Scott. This is a story of adoption of things that were already available. Telemedicine existed, decentralized trials existed. They all struggled for adoption. And I think as we start to aspire to see our ways out of this pandemic, the real question now is what's going to be sustaining innovation versus change that got us through and kept our businesses going during this chaos. But will there be a regression back to our old approaches, or will we be able to create the right sustaining environment for these innovations to outlast COVID?
Sure. So, Craig, I know you and I have spoken before. You've also been on the show, and I guess introduced yourself to Scott. But look, I guess my question, probably the question on the tip of the tongue of a lot of people, is why right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, right now, if you look at the clinical trial space, as a great example, the medicine development portfolio around the world was at risk a year ago last spring. And I'm not talking about COVID medicines because they didn't exist back then. These are the medicines in oncology, cardiovascular disease, neurology, all of the different therapeutic areas around the world. All of these studies were in jeopardy. And it was really the rapid adoption of these new approaches that kept these clinical trials going, that kept our medicine development portfolio around the world going. It was really the willingness of people to start to suddenly embrace. So I think that right now we've seen this community get past a lot of inertia, right? We've overcome the first barrier around, can we actually use some of these tools in our environment in a legal and compliant way? Many of the initial reasons why people might have a tendency to say no in the first place, we've gotten past those. So now it's really just a question of sustaining. It's not so much a question for many of these organizations and leaders of, can I implement these different approaches? Now it's a question of, can I keep them? And keeping them is a very different story. That's a story of organizational commitment. That's a story of change management. That's a story of culture and readiness to encourage people to keep using these new approaches and not revert back. I think, though, as we think about what is really a very competitive landscape, I think that many clinical research operators appreciate that there's not a sustainable future for them in going back, that they're not going to be able to compete for enrollment. They're not going to be able to, if you're an investigator in research, you're not going to be able to compete for new studies. If you're a sponsor designing yet another clinical trial in a given disease area, you're not going to be able to compete for enrollment if you keep relying on the old approaches while the rest of the community is moving forward. And I think that competitive spirit inside of this industry is probably going to be an important catalyst for keeping this change going.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen a lot of that, certainly from my involvement with the recruitment side of things, the competitive, the market is really buzzing at the moment. But perhaps one of the biggest things I've seen has been just this huge focus on decentralized trials, and I guess remote trials, telemedicine. So look, I guess to the guys at perhaps at MedVector, if you could perhaps sort of pitch in on that, what sort of impact have you seen in that area?
Well, as far as the adoption of our business model, we were, talking to pharma for, a couple of years before the pandemic. And while people got it and they liked it, it was still very much of, that's not how we do it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I constantly was asking, well, why not? Why couldn't we do it, this way? And it was just kind of running around in a circle. And so the pandemic really kind of forced everybody to step outside their comfort zone and look at new opportunities just by, this forced adoption. And so, the timeline for MedVector, really started ticking in about January of this year. It wasn't when we founded the company. So fortunately, we had a huge head start in getting our technology and our business model to market. And it's looking like a pretty interesting solution.
Mm-hmm. So,
James, Scott and Ted were ahead of the curve, right? In preceding the pandemic. When I first met them, and thank you, by the way, for that kind introduction, their work reminded me a lot of a conversation that I had 10 years ago at Pfizer when we were doing that original remote trial. And so we had designed the first fully decentralized trial, and I was walking the hallways because we were able to do that back then. And I was stopped in the hallways by a gentleman who was the VP and head for commercial development at Pfizer. And he had pointed out to me there that he saw how these remote and decentralized studies were going to enable a new way for us to engage physicians in the community. That at the time, companies like Pfizer could only invite physicians to be investigators or invite them to send their patients away and refer them to investigators. And for the vast majority of physicians, both of those are unappealing pathways. And that this idea of a remote investigator could actually enable a third option that didn't exist. And I remembered it and I filed it away, but I filed it away under like wait and see, because as Scott just mentioned, without having this momentum around decentralized, I think it's hard for pharma to appreciate a new model like this. In a lot of ways, like now that we're seeing this adoption of decentralized, what MedVector is doing is it feels like it's the first of a new ecosystem of capabilities that are going to start to emerge as a consequence of decentralization. And I'm really excited to see how this shift in how we're doing our studies enables these types of new business models to emerge that we couldn't make happen 3 years ago.
So let me kind of fill everybody in that isn't familiar with MedVector on what MedVector is and what we do. And so there's really kind of two key components that MedVector does. And the first is we are enabling local physicians to offer clinical trial medications as care options for their local patients. Now, this is something that just simply wasn't available before the MedVector model and before the decentralized clinical trial model. Now, on the flip side of that, what we're also doing is we're enabling patients the ability to participate in clinical studies regardless of where they live, because now they can do it from their local doctor's office rather than having to live close to a clinical trial site. And so I think Craig, you can speak to the existing challenges as far as patient recruitment and the struggles about how doctors do them and where patients want to hear from them. And this has kind of been an elegant solution in enabling those two parties to come together.
Yeah, we've, James, people have talking with enthusiasm about clinical research as a care option for a while now. How do we enable all patient encounters to be ones where a patient can learn about research, where they're obtaining care? And it makes sense that people would think that way, because when you look at data from places like CISCRP, I always have to take a deep breath before I spell it out, the Center for Information on the Study of Clinical Research Participation, but CISCRP does some amazing data gathering each year on perceptions and insights related to people and research. And it's there that you see over and again that the overwhelmingly preferred path for how people want to learn about research is from their existing physicians, which makes sense. That's who they're making shared decisions around their treatments, and that's where they want to learn about research as another option. And yet we know that for that to happen requires serendipity. You happen to go to a doctor who happens to be an investigator. That happens to be the right study for you. It's kind of crazy that the system ever works. But to actually start to find these models where now physicians in the community don't have to be investigators, but can be motivated and aware and incentivized in a legal and ethical way to have conversations with patients about trials that may be right for them is kind of game changing.
It is indeed.
The other thing that I wanted to really talk about within that why right now concept is that because of the pandemic, on average, physicians' practice revenue has decreased 55% since the COVID-19 crisis began. 55%. Patient volume has dropped 60%. And that just came out in an MGMA report that was just reported this month. And so why right now? Well, there's certainly the need for that physician to look at other ways that they can make sure that they're trying to not only get advanced medicine to their patient, but protect the income and the staff that they have at their practice. And so I think that there's an openness to clinical trial as a care option approach in the physician world to a certain degree because of the impact of the pandemic.
I think also the point that both yourself and Scott have spoken to, Ted, is really about that change of mindset in the physician, in that if they do it the old way, nothing's going to change. And medicine is moving forward rapidly. The old way is very conservative, is very constrained. And as we know, scientists, myself included, we like protocols, we like fix, we like to work to a certain structure. And I mean, we've all experienced it personally and professionally over the last year, 18 months, how that has had to shift in our day-to-day working, never mind, the collaborations that we're seeing and experiencing even now, is around that adoption of engagement, isn't it? It's engagement with healthcare professionals and patients, but it's also using the tools at our disposal that perhaps we just took for granted before, now are an essential part of everything that we're doing.
Adam, I can't agree more. And I think that operationally, I've had the pleasure of working with some very, very large health systems that are numbering in the 4,000 physicians in a multi-specialty network, and being involved with an MSO that had 400 plus doctors involved in it. And I can tell you right now, you can say all you want about aligning incentives and all that type of importance, but really what that means is I need to make sure that I am protecting, from the doctor's perspective, I need to make sure that I'm protecting my market share. That's the patient. I'm protecting my revenue source. I have a clear path to how I can make money and income for this. And probably most importantly, I am protecting my time to make sure that I'm able to provide the medicine and care to my patients that I want to do. And I think that if you can keep those three elements in mind when you're going at engaging the physician with clinical trials, then all of a sudden it turns the prism a little bit, and you're able then to have a conversation with them where clinical trials is not a something that's being pushed away, but it's something that's being welcomed.
So Ted, look, on that, I guess, point, I mean, what is it like for doctors right now? Because we're hearing, for me as a recruiter, I'm always on LinkedIn. I see patient centricity plastered pretty much everywhere. Look, to the outside individual, what does this mean? What's missing, and how, I guess, how could that perhaps be changed? What's the real message here that I when we're seeing that, what does that really mean?
So I think that there's a couple of things with that. I certainly am in agreement that we need to be patient-centric and patient-focused, and make sure it's easy for all of us to get care and to be involved in the clinical trials. But what I think is changed, and what I think part of what MedVector does, is that the path to being patient-centric is through the doctor. Because as Craig mentioned earlier, it's the most trusted relationship that you're going to have is between the treating doctor and myself. I'm the patient. That's the relationship that's going to be trusted. So if my doctor comes to me and says, you should consider this clinical trial as a care option, I'm going to be interested. And that opens up all sorts of other avenues around being able to reach and have a more diverse population for clinical trials, to have a better stickiness for patients to be involved in trials. But to get to that conversation, you must be able to make sure that you're making sure that doctor is not referring their patient away. That doctor has a clear path to how they're going to be able to make revenue and income for their path, because that protects the staff that they've hired, and you're protecting their time.
Sure.
It's such an interesting point that, I think sometimes people perceive that they almost misconstrue patient centricity and direct to patient. They almost assume that by blasting things to patients, I'm being patient centric, when I think Ted makes a very interesting point, which is, by stopping and listening to patients, understanding their preference and executing based on that is the path to patient centricity. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're blasting information and messages just directly to patients. That's not really the right vision for patient centricity. And here, the patient voice has been very clear. They want to learn about research from their care team.
Mm-hmm. And look, I guess I think this has always been the brain boggler for me, is because I'm guilty of that myself, Greg, and I think there's probably many people out there that are also. I guess my question is, where are, say, MedVector unique? And perhaps to you, Scott, look, as a finance expert turned healthcare CEO, are there challenges as an industry outsider, perhaps like myself? How have you guys done, dealt with this, and how are you, infiltrating a market that is fairly fresh to yourself? And what's allowing you to, leverage your previous skills?
So, all right. So throwing the outsider under the bus. Okay. Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Look, you've been here before. You know what to expect.
Well, the easy way to answer that is I do what you do, right? I surround myself by experts and I stay out of the way, right? And that's that. So you're absolutely right. Selling into healthcare requires a bit of a pedigree. And being an outsider, I don't have that pedigree. I'm not a doctor, right? I haven't run clinical studies. I haven't worked for Pfizer. I haven't worked with practices or done any of that budgeting. But the experience that I do have in finance is still relevant for running and putting a company together. But I would say that the best way to address being an outsider is not trying to be an expert. So, my biggest role is making sure that the team that surrounds me is effective. And like I said, then get out of their way, give them the tools necessary for them to be successful. And, I think we see it, quite often, and this is, my finance side talking when I've helped other startups is, occasionally you'll see a scientist become a CEO or a programmer become a CEO. And typically it's a better fit for that person to be that expert rather than the leader for the company. They can still be, very much a voice of the direction of the company, but where they want to be is in research, is programming, in creating the product, but not necessarily dealing with the day-to-day operations and logistics of the company itself. And so I think that you tend to see some conflict occasionally when you have an expert acting as the driving force for the company. And so I think that a benefit that I have is I know that I'm not the expert. So, I try not to let my ego get in the way, and I try to make sure that I have the right people for those right roles. And then I make sure everybody's pointed in the right direction. And again, I stay out of their way and give them the tools that they need to be successful.
Sure. So you're kind of the idea man, the businessman behind, I guess, what you're trying to achieve. But look, I guess in general, perhaps to Ted, Scott, all of you guys, why do you think it is that the healthcare market is so ripe and ready for innovations like this right now? And perhaps what's been holding things back to this point is, I guess, probably the question from me and many others.
Well, I'll jump in. First, I think that just to talk a little bit about Scott and finding the right people, I think the other thing that certainly does help is that, there is a lot of excellent companies, fantastic people that are established in this marketplace. And so there's a lot of factors that they realize that there needs to be some change, but factors stop that from happening. Now, though, today, and to a certain extent because of COVID, there's been several reports, and I'm seeing this from conversations with sponsors and with CROs and principal investigators. It's about 75% of sponsors right now are incorporating virtual elements into studies. And 73% of those sites are using telemedicine after the pandemic. So really, why now? What can happen with this? It's Scott being someone that certainly is on the outsider, but being able to ask that question, why is this not being accepted right now? And then finding those folks and getting to that person that is an existing player in a large company, a large sponsor, what have you, and being able to go after them and say, hey, let's look at our process and understand what we can do incrementally to make a change, to have some impact in our particular world in increasing participation with a simple outreach to the doctor. But there's other areas that are being very, very much impacted because of kind of the release of ideas that exist today because of the certain extent, the COVID effect.
Sure, Adam, it looks like you want to jump in there. I'll let you jump in there.
You make a great point. I wanted to also make the point, not only has Scott surrounded himself with very good people, but actually, to be fair to him, he has an awful lot of charisma, and he might not say this himself, but actually, I think Scott has an interesting backstory, but more importantly, he has charisma. He has a certain status that goes, that precedes him. And in any organization, you need a figurehead. And I think Scott is absolutely that figurehead, working alongside yourself, Ted, in pushing the vision forward, knowing very clearly what MedVector is, and on the flip side, what MedVector isn't. And that's what I hear and see regularly, and for full disclosure, I've been working with these guys for some time now, and I've seen that firsthand. There is a clear vision, there is a clear structure, and what Scott speaks to around the point of having often in many similar companies, having a medic at the lead or a medically qualified person, by very definition, they come with a whole set of different skills, different to those that Scott and Ted come to the party with. So, there is that differentiator as well. And I think it's a key point to make as well around personality, fit, and identifying a gap and really pushing that door open as hard as he possibly can. And I see that firsthand, actually.
Well, thank you, Adam. I would just add that, sometimes innovation is just an outside perspective, right? So it's just somebody looking at things differently. Yeah. So, an example of that everybody's familiar with is, you talk about Uber, right? So the guys that started Uber were not taxi drivers, right? They were people that wanted rides and saw a broken model and saw a way to fix it using a bunch of existing technology. And that's similar to, what MedVector is doing. And so, it's not about being the smartest guy in the room. Sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time and adding that fresh perspective.
And absolutely acting on that idea and making it happen.
Well, taking the leap is a big part of it. Yeah.
That's quite, without a safety net, that's quite a leap you've taken, I would say.
It's taking a leap, and it's being persistent around and committed to the change, but not to the point of being foolhardy, right? Like there's a certain amount of persistence here that was required. It could have been easy to step back and say the market ain't buying this. Right? Because it is hard to sell innovative new solutions here. James, you mentioned earlier, why is now the market ready for innovation? I don't even know if they really are in earnest, but I know they're adopting some, right? And, some is enough to enable players like MedVector to get this kind of momentum right now, right? Because they ride on the heels of DCT so elegantly that when sponsors say, we're already using video, we're already using mobile nurses, now it's like an incremental innovation rather than something radical. But, requires leadership persistence, like a lot of entrepreneurs, but not to the point of being foolhardy. At some point, Scott may have had to have pulled the parachute and said, we gave it a go and it wasn't the right solution. But fortunately for the ecosystem, he didn't do it before COVID-19. And now, companies like this are able to ride this adoption curve.
And look at the air miles you saved over the last 18 months, Scott, by doing it this way, rather than jumping on planes and trains and automobiles.
Yep.
Well, look, I know that Scott's probably not the man that would probably like to pull the cord. I've heard a few stories about his past and sort of his sporting achievements, etc. And I know that sort of drives a lot of motivation. But look, there's others in the market, I guess. There's a lot of new companies out there, a lot of innovation, and a lot of startups. So in general, guys, putting MedVector perhaps to one side, is there room for everyone? What do you think is going to perhaps be the differentiator between who makes it and perhaps who doesn't? Is there something there that perhaps, I guess, makes MedVector unique, stand out, other than your good selves? You're all fantastic gents to speak to. And as Adam said, a lot of charisma there between, you guys as a collaborative. But what else is it that you think that will allow you guys to stand out and perhaps others that are doing things in other lines of work?
Like in any one category, there's really only so many players that are going to survive. Now, in some categories around how clinical research dollars are spent, there is enough spend that multiple can survive. Although in some categories, there's been so much capital raised that there are some extraordinary targets that the leaders have to be able to bring back in terms of sustaining some of their own growth expectations.
Mhm.
But, you know, in a lot of those cases, these are companies that are competing for the same dollar within that life cycle of how pharma spends their clinical research spend. What's interesting here is how a player like MedVector is able to fit into an ecosystem amidst DCT players, investigator sites, CROs, recruitment vendors, and fit in a collaborative way the way that they are. And it's an interesting niche. And I think that it's a fortunate one. I think it's a pretty rare one that you're not bumping into lots of other stakeholders in this particular space, but can complement even integrated research organizations, companies that are trying to help research-naive physicians to become investigators. It's a pretty unique story to be able to complement quite as many as they do. I'm sure there are others out there. I know there are others out there that likewise have found similar niches, but it's pretty hard to find.
Impressive stuff. And look, Adam, I guess, look, Scott mentioned earlier, perhaps the importance of a team, and, you know, clearly that's where he comes in. He's the industry outsider of, you know, I've thrown him under that bus already, but he's defended himself well. Well played, Scott. But look, as our resident healthcare expert, biometrics expert, what are your thoughts again on, I guess, the team that Scott has built, and perhaps, I guess, as my typical co-host, you know, give us a summary on perhaps why right now, why MedVector, to bring us in for a landing.
Well, as I said, Scott has enormous charisma, and that takes me back to the first time that we spoke, actually. He contacted me and made direct contact on LinkedIn, and I sent him over my number, and before I knew it, my phone was ringing and we were doing a FaceTime, and I was walking my dogs over in the fields not far from where I live. Anyway, an hour and a half later, as the sun was going down and my phone was dying literally in my hand and it was getting dark, my phone was pinging. My wife was ringing me saying, "Where on earth have you fallen down a ditch or something?" We were still talking, and this was the first time we'd ever spoken. And I did, you know, full disclaimer at the time. I said to Scott, "Look, I'm out walking my dogs. I'm happy to talk." Put the camera on, and we were stood there. Literally, my arm was dropping off, and yet everything that Scott was saying to me and our engagement was just on point. You know, it was just pinging. The messages were so strongly resonating with me, and they've continued to do so in all of our engagements since. And what I think, you know, he's managed to do is really surround himself with industry leaders. You know, Craig would not bang his own drum, but to be quite clear, you know, if there's a mountain, Craig is sitting on the top of that with regards to DCT, his influence and his experience in decentralized clinical trials, alongside someone, you know, a healthcare seasoned professional like Ted, and there are many others on the advisory board as well who I've come into contact with, and without exception, they follow a similar theme. You know, they're committed professional people who deliver and absolutely speak to the points that MedVector are all about. You know, they're about engaging patients, unlocking patients, with healthcare professionals across the globe. You know, this isn't a model that just sits in the US as well. And I think this is a key point to make. Irrespective of the governance models within whichever geography we're talking about, this model fits. It fits to the UK, to Europe, to the US, globally. And there aren't many that can say that, I would say, because it's agnostic. It's effectively an agnostic system that can be applied to any setting. So, you know, I've probably covered a lot of bases there, but actually, you know, in a roundabout way, there is an incredible opportunity here. And I think it's about timing, it's about hitting the sweet spot, but also about getting the right technology and a very, very strong leadership team around that message. You're nodding, Scott. Do you want to come in and tell your side of that story?
I was just going to say, Adam, you're hired. Keep going.
But it sounds like you have created a phenomenal team there, Scott, and how you've done it is impressive. You know, there's clearly no messing about on your end. You know, if someone puts you in touch with someone, you're straight on the ball. You know, even, you know, that story with Adam, his phone was ringing before he even knew it. His wife was wondering where he was. So look, it is pretty incredible what you guys have done. I remember when you first came on the show, I was blown away by the business model. And look, if anyone tuning in has not checked out MedVector, our podcast episode with Scott, or their explainer video that is also available on YouTube, highly recommend it because it is incredible and it's simplified. And I think that was one of the big things that I got from you, Scott, when you and I first spoke. I think you may well have to remind me of your quote about simplicity, if you will.
Ted?
Over to Ted. Oh, he's put you under the bus, Ted. There you go.
Oh, we may have lost Ted. He
may have lost Ted. Well, look, fortunately,
Ted has actually reinvented the quote and it's better. And he did it like 2 days ago. But what we used to always say is simplicity is the ultimate complication. And what that means is it's really hard to get something down to its most simple form. You know, you can create something that has a lot of buttons, or you can create a slick device that has minimal buttons, just the buttons that you need. And, you know, my mother would tell you that that's how she wants all TV remotes to be created. And instead the TV remotes, they put as many buttons on it as they can. And it drives my mother crazy. And so it's that whole concept of simplicity being difficult.
There you go. I guess simplicity sometimes is very difficult, as we're experiencing right now with Zoom. The fact that Ted has whipped off, he's managed to jump back in.
That's right.
Seamless. Look at that.
Well, Ted, what was the new simplicity quote?
Simplicity is the ultimate complication.
Well, no, but yesterday we came up with something new, or you said something new, and we both got excited.
There's so many words of wisdom that come out of my mouth. It's hard to keep track of all of them. Really. It really is.
This is true.
There you go. And that's just some of them. Well, look, guys, it's been an absolute pleasure having you, I guess, back on the show to share a bit more about what's been going on with sort of MedVector, the industry in general, and how we're going to change that industry. I think you've given some great insights here, and your standpoint and viewpoint on patient centricity being a bit of an eye-opener for me. I'm sure it perhaps will be the same for many others. But look, before we close the show, is there anything else that you guys would like to give us a quick insight onto before we wrap up and let you all get on to enjoy the rest of your day?
My insight is that everybody has to keep listening to your content here, James. It's great to it's
fantastic, isn't it? It's fantastic.
It's good stuff, man. I appreciate it.
You and
Thank
Adam
you for
are a
doing
great
this.
team. Yeah, you're a great team, and I think that you look at the roster of guests that you've had come down the pike here has been just extremely educational and motivational for me as well. So excellent job.
This would never have happened had it not been for the pandemic. I'm sure James and I would never have come into contact. And actually, none of us, well, certainly, I don't think I'd have had the opportunity to be in the virtual room here. That's for sure.
Definitely. Well, look, guys, as I've said before, it's an absolute pleasure to have you back on the show. Thanks once again for being a part of the Huxley Morton podcast, and have a fantastic day. Thanks for tuning in. And if you got value from this video, hit the like button and let me know what you thought in the comments. And of course, if you're new to this channel and you want to follow the stories of industry leaders, this is definitely the channel for you. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video.